Welcome back to Holistic Healing Association. I'm Erin Darcy. I'm certified in embodied processing and certified clinical hypnosis. Today, I have with me Robin Scott. Thank you so much for joining us. And if you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Erin. Good to be here. Um, I run a small clinical solution-focused hypnotherapy practice where I do psychotherapy, hypnotherapy. I work as an embodied processing practitioner, and I do integral eye movement therapy and other somatic techniques within my practice.
Okay. And where are you located?
So I'm in England.
What part of England?
I'm the north of England in West Yorkshire.
Nice. A close friend of mine is from there.
Oh, brilliant. Lovely.
Yeah, yeah. Paul Diamond. So, and today we're part of a mini series on healing developmental trauma with compassion and grace. And today we're going to be talking about how developmental trauma can lead into mental health struggles. And Robin, do you have a trauma story that you'd like to share with us?
I do. My trauma story really is how I got into being a therapist, which I think is true of a lot of therapists. We have a very lived experience of that. Now, my trauma was both within the home and without of the home, and crossed many decades, really. So, as a small child, I lived in Lebanon in a little town called Brumana, nestled in the mountains between Israel and Beirut, at a time of active bombardments. So we lived there for a while in the early 80s. And I can trace, although I was very young and I don't have vivid memories of it. I have much more sensory memories of it. And I do remember some things. My brother remembers a lot more than me, but he's 2 years older than me. So I was only very little at the time. But I do remember when we got back, it had sort of really affected me, and I suffered from PTSD, with nightmares, flashbacks, and it was only actually really recently, in the last couple of years, that my mum was telling me a story about one of the bombardments, and I suddenly realised that that was the PTSD dream that I'd had throughout my entire childhood and well into my late 20s.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, and I couldn't believe that she'd never put the two and two together either. When it had been, I was screaming the house down several nights a week, waking up, sweating, crying, absolutely inconsolable. And it went all the way through my childhood from when I was about 5 years old when we got back to the UK to to well into my 20s, possibly my early 30s even. And I think because of that trauma, the rest of my development was it was affected. And unfortunately, my living situation with my family, there was a lot of links to paedophilia and grooming gangs, and well, grooming groups, not gangs, as you would think, which obviously had a huge effect on my upbringing. and then going, obviously, with things going on at home, there was, that then impacted my ability to form friendships.
How
And
old were you? How old?
I, from, well, I would say throughout my whole life. So I remember starting to be incredibly confused by people, like by my peer group. And I really remember that from about 7 or 8 years old. And I really remember this, this really drawing away from people. And I've always been a bubbly, excitable person. I love making connections. I love making friends. Um, and that spirit was there. But the connections that I was making, the feedback I was getting from people made me feel incredibly alone. And then the connections that I did make were not with very healthy sort of people. So I struggled a lot with friendships that were incredibly toxic and incredibly damaging through my early life, and then being severely bullied at school until my teenage years, when I just rebelled, which is a perfectly normal trauma. Um, so yeah, you can either withdraw, or you can rebel. And it was the 90s, so I rebelled. um and then again, there was a lot of trauma within that as well. There was the kind of, there was violence, there was suspensions, there was special education measures, social services. That there was a lot to contend with. And I felt that at the time, because my experience within the grooming had not been validated, that really led to that rebellion, which is often the case because it's incredibly complex trauma, to have been involved in grooming, because it's all about mind manipulation and emotional manipulation as well.
It's very common.
Mm.
Very common to rebel because there's a lot of pain. And how did you rebel?
Um, I got into drinking, I was skipping school, I was walking out of class, a lot of things that actually now, like looking back on them, you would be able to, sort of say, oh, nowadays that would be seen as a neurodivergent response, or sort of ADHD. But at the time, nobody understood, and I was just blamed for it. And I remember, very vividly overhearing a conversation of, an aunt saying, that she didn't know how my mother coped with me. And, and that stayed with me. And,
Therapy.
because that's blame and that's shame, of being, I couldn't help how I was responding. I didn't know why I was responding like that. I just knew that nobody understood and nobody could see what had happened. There was just such a lack of validation of my experience, that it kind of really pushed me to act out in every possible way. And then that led to me, kind of becoming a young mother at 19, uh, and then getting divorced very quickly. Very, very quickly, sort of within the 6 months of having my daughter, we were separated, and then raising my daughter as a single mom, and having, you know, bad relationships.
Hmm. I became a single mom when my child was 6 months old too. So exactly 6 months is he had left the house. So um
I think when we get protective over our children, I think there's a thing that's just so deep inside that says, whatever I've been through, I don't want my child to suffer that. So if there's something wrong with the relationship, if they are triggering a childhood trauma within you, then you are going to say, no way, not to my child, and that's it. And it might not be them. There might not actually be anything particularly wrong with them. It might just be that they're triggering that response, that memory within you.
mhm. Okay. And when did you start your healing journey?
Well, I then went on to, I've always strived to do things, and I've always looked at healing from being young, I think. And I think that's part of, that's part of the trauma as well, is that I was ended up being very much a caretaker to my father, who was the groomer. Um, so I've always really wanted to heal, and I trained in holistic therapies, so doing massage and reflexology when I was quite young, but didn't have the confidence to actually create a business in that. And I could never understand how you can work and raise a child at the same time. um, is what do you do in the holidays? Um, and I was friends with a lot of single parents as well. So we all helped each other out, and, and it was lovely. But we did, um, we liked to have fun, and we drank a lot. And I think the drinking was also very much a coping skill, coping mechanism. And when I was about late 30s, I started to get poorly. And first thing, I got a virus, which I just couldn't kick. And then my thyroid switched. I'd always had a hyperactive thyroid, and my thyroid went underactive. And then my health just kept going downhill until eventually I was diagnosed with ME, or chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia, a chronic
That
pain.
from trauma.
Yeah, exactly. And then sort of most recently, they're looking at FND, which is functional neurological disorder, which is very linked to childhood trauma as well. So because of that, and then that kind of tied in, I just left work. I'd been off work for a very long time. I just went on sick. I'd been reducing my hours for about a year, and I finally got to the point where I can't work anymore, and actually went off sick in January 2020. And obviously, then COVID happened. And so, not working, and then nobody else is working, and drinking with my partner of the time, and started drinking more. It was acceptable, it was okay, and more people were drinking heavily to cope with what was going on, which is quite reasonable. But it was, and I was doing it as well for the false energy that the alcohol gives you, because the alcohol sugars can be changed into energy quite easily by the body. So when you've got chronic fatigue syndrome, it's one of those that gives you this false energy for a while, but then of course you're exhausted after it. So it was like these big kind of highs and lows and highs and lows, and my mental health started to really, really suffer. And I remember speaking, I thought, I knew that I had trauma. I always knew that I had trauma. I'd always kind of tried to deal with it, but, I was, not in a place to do that. And then I just thought, oh no, something has got to give here. And I signed up and had to wait for trauma therapy, which was just, 10 sessions that you get on the NHS, which you have to wait 18 months for. And I remember the lady doing the assessment saying we don't advise that anybody gives up drinking or anything like that while they're waiting, because it's your coping skill and it's what's got you to this point now alive. And that really struck home to me. So then it was like a green flag, like, oh, just keep drinking, it's fine. And after about 6 months of that, I was like, no, I need to stop. So I went to see a hypnotherapist. My friend had seen them and they just qualified and they were doing, the 5 sessions for really cheap while they were doing their hypnotherapy in practice diploma. So I had 5 sessions and gave up drinking and was like, that is amazing. That is
That is amazing.
absolutely amazing. Yeah, absolutely. And it just gave me just that it calmed my nervous system, which obviously after years and years of trauma, that was amazing, and that allowing my body to go into that rest and digest phase, just slightly, just gave me enough energy to be able to start doing other things. And at that point, I was so ill I could barely leave the house. I was using a walking stick. I could only walk just down the road. I wouldn't be able to walk very far, even just using a walking stick. I was using a walking stick around the house. I was spending most days in bed, completely incapacitated. And so having that bit of energy to get on top of everything else was amazing. And I signed up straight away for a hypnotherapy diploma, which was 10 months.
There you
Um,
go.
yeah. And so I remember going in for my first day at the hypnotherapy class with my walking stick. And then 10 months later, just before I graduated, I walked up Snowdon, a big mountain.
Oh, that's cool.
All by myself. Yeah. So after 10 months of, training as a hypnotherapist, when you're doing hypnotherapy every day, because that's the nature of training. So the knock-on effect with me, obviously people that I was training with, they were practicing on me. I was practicing on, 10 people a week. So getting the knock-on effect from giving the hypnotherapy sort of really helped. And then after that, I thought, this is great. This is really good. I can do all of this stuff, but there's still this thing. I'm still not meeting the world in a way that I know that I can be. There's a lot of things that are still blocking my way and blocking my full recovery. And that's when I discovered embodied processing and signed up with the Centre of Healing. And I also qualified in integral eye movement therapy as well. So I'd had that for sort of 5 months and then went on to the embodied processing. And I feel like that, has helped me get to the place where I am now. And obviously, each thing that I've learned for myself, I've also learned to do as a therapist.
And would you say that embodied processing was the missing piece of the puzzle?
Absolutely. I think doing working top down has so much benefit, and you can work with the nervous system within it, but it's kind of like you need to go further. You need to have that full body experience, because that's where the trauma's trapped, that's where we have it.
And what is the science behind embodied processing?
So the science behind embodied processing is really interesting. It's it's the same with all somatic work, really. So it leverages on the neuroplasticity of um, of the brain. So you do have the sort of neuroscience backed effects of that. But then it works specifically with the autonomic nervous system, which is where the trauma is held. And so working together, it enables that healing to take place. So it's basically a way of rebalancing that autonomic nervous system. So what happens is when you have a session, you can go into it and you're going into your body and you're finding the places that hold that trauma. Each traumatic experience that we have is held within our bodies. And if we are not brought back to homeostasis, so what we want to do is when something really bad happens, when something really scary happens, we want to then be comforted and we want our nervous systems to come back to being grounded again. And what happens with trauma is those events that happen and we're not brought back to that place of comfort, of safety. So then it gets trapped in this loop, and we find that our bodies, because they've held on to this trauma, because there's been no release from it, because that loop has not been created where we've come back to being grounded again, it's always trying to find that moment of grounding. It's always trying to find that coming back to safety so it can release. And really, in EP, that's what you're doing. You're bringing the body back. You're finding those parts, those moments in your life where something bad has happened. You become dysregulated and you're finding that regulation again. And once you've found that regulation, you either process those events and use that, and they get turned into something that's useful for your present, or you can release them. But until you do that, they're stuck in this sort of never-ending loop, trying to find that moment of resource again.
And what does the word healing mean to you? I think you basically just covered it.
Yeah, I think really what I see as any kind of, when you have dysregulation, you have emotional dysregulation that has affected your body or mind and your emotions, it's affected your relationships, it's affected your ability to be present in the world and to be your authentic self. I think healing is when you can be your authentic self. It's that ability to meet the world in presence.
Good answer. And here is the big question that everyone is wondering. How can developmental trauma lead to mental health struggles, such as bipolar, eating disorders, borderline personality disorder, anxiety, OCD, depression, just to name a few. PTSD.
Complex PTSD. All of them. So again, it's back to that dysregulation. And the dysregulation actually affects, so that's your nervous system. It's dysregulation of your autonomic nervous system with the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. And so what happens is the HPA, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And this is the parts that are crucial in your brain, your hypothalamus, your pituitary gland, and your adrenal. So they are all involved in managing your hormones and balancing your hormones. So which allows you to deal with your day-to-day life. So that is all of your emotional output, input and output. And that's how you deal with stress. It's how you deal with the good things in life too, because you often find like a big part of people feeling depressed and anxious, or that have dealt with trauma. It's the way that they detach from life and they don't feel emotion, because the emotion that they felt, that was too strong for them, and they don't want, there's that part of them that doesn't want to feel emotion because that's scary. So it stops them from being able to feel any emotion. And that has a physical part, and that's your HPA axis. And it's really interesting because that's the control point of all of these hormones. So they're putting senses out to get information, and then they're processing the information put back to them. And what happens, especially with developmental trauma, is when we're growing up, and obviously, we're taking in so much information, we're processing that information, and we're creating things that we call schemas. And schemas are they're like a kind of like a sort of, oh, what do we call them? Um, like a map of what every situation is. So it's a little guide. It's a little kind of like, so you've got a flip chart in your hippocampus, and for every situation you come into, the hippocampus is going to throw out one of these schemas, and it's going to say, oh, this we know what to do in this situation. This is what we can expect. And so this is how we behave, and this is what we expect to happen. And it's quicker than our thought processes. So it enables us to respond really quickly to the environment around us. Now, when we're going through especially developmental trauma, what happens is that these schemas are incredibly negative, because if you're going through trauma all of the time on a regular basis, so through neglect, abuse, a myriad of things that can cause developmental trauma, but it's prolonged. And that means that and it can be at any time in life. It doesn't need to be as you're developing as a child, because we're always developing. So it can be just prolonged moments of trauma within our lives that have this impact on us. And it's because of these schemas that we create end up being, because we're in survival mode for all of that time, our survival response ticking on. We're not thinking about how to thrive, we're just surviving. So when we're surviving, we're using what we call the primitive part of the brain, and this part is just about our safety and survival. It doesn't care about anything else. Like if there was a polar bear out there, it would, you would get the response to run. So what would happen? You'd get hot and sweaty, your heart rate would increase, and you'd be off like a shot.
Exactly.
And obviously, yeah, and that's great. But in our day-to-day lives, that's not so great. So when you're going through these prolonged times of stress, which cause trauma, then that fight or flight not being able to switch off, it causes this HPA axis to become hyperactive as well. We become hypervigilant. We generally we just can't cope with what's going on. We'll be over emotional, we'll get overwhelmed by things, and we'll be very negative because the primitive mind needs to be negative. It needs to protect you. It's looking for the danger everywhere. So if you're creating schemas of the outside world, of in each situation, what to expect in each situation, and you're looking at it from a survival perspective, those schemas are very negative. You're learning not to trust people. You're learning to be scared of people. You're learning that everywhere is dangerous.
Putting up an
You
emotional
know,
wall towards people, not allowing anyone in because no one is safe. You can't trust anyone because people hurt.
exactly. Exactly. And you can see how so much behavior can stem from that kind of thinking, yeah.
Yeah. And how does a person know they have trauma? Because there are so many, myself included, don't know they have trauma. I did not realize I had trauma. I came in for training for embodied processing, and I was like, I'm ready to help people with trauma. I'm here to train. And people kept on saying, look again. And I was like, there's nothing to see. But most people have had some type of traumatic experience that they have not processed. And there's some they have not processed in their body, and it remains. And we need to process all of our emotions because that is trauma.
Exactly.
And
Well,
it's
that's it.
not sorry, go ahead.
Well, because trauma is subjective.
It's not what
It's
happens to you, it's what happens inside of you.
absolutely. And I think a lot of people, and especially, for people sort of very much like myself that didn't have that trauma validated, um, you can go through life believing that you've got no trauma, but you might have anger issues. You might find that you can't handle stress. You might find that the relationships that you're building are not healthy relationships. You might find that you have unhealthy relationships with food or alcohol, or you might have an addictive personality. There may be many addictions in your life. We tend to throw out addiction as being, kind of drugs and alcohol, but there's so much more now, especially with social media addiction, gambling, shopping, online shopping. That's a
The
huge
phone,
thing. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, and we're all guilty of that, and I work in this field, and I have to make sure that I have all of the apps to block me from social media during the day so I can actually be productive, They're all on timers so that I'm not just, and I'll find that I'll just pick my phone up and I'll just go straight to Facebook. I wasn't picking my phone up to go on Facebook. I was picking my phone up for a completely different reason.
exactly. Yeah. And a lot of often addiction, it all comes from one place, and it doesn't matter the type of addiction, it all comes from a place of pain. And
Yeah, disconnection.
I know my signs of trauma was deep, deep shame and anxiety, but you're not always going to recognize that.
I didn't realize that my lack of self-esteem and my low confidence, I didn't realize that that was a result, and that took a lot of work to get over. and it's finally, to feel sort of free of that is one of the best feelings in the world. It's something that I've been carrying around with me, that's been weighing me down, that every time I've tried to take a step forward, it's been pulling me back again and again and again.
And it's so common for people. Yeah. Or being
Yeah.
afraid to be seen, right? Wanting to stay small.
Yeah,
And would you say embodied processing has impacted your life?
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I use it for myself on a daily basis. I use my place of resource to just calm myself down. I use the techniques of grounding and resourcing that are so important for everybody. And I like to teach my clients very early on. Doesn't matter what they come to me about, but I like to teach them some grounding techniques, as
They're
early
huge.
on as I can. Yeah,
And they can help so much if a person's struggling with dissociation. That can significantly help.
yeah.
And how can processing your emotions help people who are struggling with deep depression, OCD, anxiety, eating disorders, even schizophrenia, bipolar PTSD, complex PTSD, borderline personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder? How can processing our emotions help people that are struggling with all mental health struggles?
Well, when we look at all of these unprocessed emotions, we can see them as, little barriers, or maybe they're little ropes around us, holding us tethered to a place that we don't want to be. As human beings, we are fluid. We want growth. We want to move forward in life. And these are twines that keep us tethered to our past and to these very destructive memories and emotions. And each each moment and each emotion that you embody is a string taken off, and you can start to step forward without that. And as you take them off one by one and one by
And what
one
do you
after
mean
the other.
by a string?
I think so. Imagine that you're tethered to a wall by many, many strings, and each emotion is just coiled around you and keeping you tethered to that wall. And then every emotion that you've embodied is a string gone. It's a rope detached. You're getting free of your past. You're getting free of those unhealthy expectations, those unhealthy identity and emotional imprints that you have, that you're carrying through your life, that are weighing you down. Each string is connected to a weight that's holding you back, a weight that you've got to drag along with you. So you can't meet the world as yourself. You can't meet the world authentically when you've got all of these weights tied to you, holding you back. You're just concerned with getting yourself, untangled and
I
getting this
understand.
weight off you.
I
And
just
that's it. And other people, when they seem to just walk through life unhindered, you know, That's because they are. They're not dealing. Well, I mean, obviously, we see what we want to see, and everybody has their own struggles. But, many people, they are walking unhindered because they've untied those ropes. They've got rid of those weights. They are free to just glide through life. And I think, coming back to, what healing is, that's what healing is. It's getting rid of those tethers, so you can meet the world in presence. So you're not grappling with things tied to you and weights pulling you back.
Exactly. I just saw a video for another example for a metaphor, and it was like a dark shadow. Everyone has a shadow. There's a dark shadow, and that was the trauma. And it was like encouraging the person to go for that drink, to ignore that phone call, to ignore going out with friends, to go for that extra food, right?
Yeah,
Because that's what trauma does. And
yeah,
that's not our authentic selves. It's not our authentic
no,
selves.
no,
And going through this program, one thing I've learned is it doesn't matter what a person has done. It doesn't matter what they've been through. It does not impact the person's self-worth. Personally, I like to look at the person's heart. And that's where I see their inner good. And that's where I see their authentic core self.
yeah.
And what advice would you give to family members with family, spouses, children, parents that are struggling with significant mental health struggles?
I think there's there's two things. There's the people that are struggling and and what they need, and the things that they need in order to move forward. And in my practice, we work a lot with something we call the 3 Ps, and that's positive action, positive interaction, and positive thoughts. And when you put these three together and work them into your daily life, you can start to make real changes. I know that in the quit drinking world, they have something similar that's called HALT. And they say, are you hungry? Are you angry? Are you lonely? Or are you tired? So every time you think about needing a drink, think HALT. And, most of the time, uh, people are either hungry or tired, you know? Um, but a lot of people, there's lonely, and a lot of people all go to the pub, and they're going to the pub for social interaction, not for the drink. The drink is just there, and that's just a social norm that they feel that they need to partake in to get that interaction. So the positive interaction, we can get positive interaction from people, we can get it from animals too,
Oh, for sure.
which is
I get it
fantastic.
so much from my dogs.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, yeah, we absolutely, kind of, I use my cats as resource all of the time,
I know, they're
and you
great.
can feel yourself, yeah, that's it, yeah, they're great. um but human interaction, a positive human interaction, it's so important. And people can go, people that are very isolated through trauma or through chronic health, which is often a side effect from trauma, leading to that isolation, that's a huge thing. And we cannot live. We are social creatures, and and we feel good when we're living together, working together, having families, having fun. That's how we're programmed. So we really need to bring that into our lives more and be really conscious about that. And that's the sort of thing that's incredibly difficult when you are suffering from severe mental health problems. Positive action as well. I mean, when you've got severe mental health problems, it's hard to find that motivation. Your serotonin and your dopamine are depleted. It's incredibly difficult, but if you can make yourself move in any way, shape, or form, that movement, helps our bodies recalibrate. And that does kind of then start promoting a good production of serotonin and dopamine and noradrenaline, which we need for motivation as well. And positive thoughts, which obviously, we know that we can have these thought spirals, negative thought spirals. We know that we can ruminate on things that we've done, think, past events, all of these things, learning to cut them off before they start. Think about something else. And that's when being mindful comes in. And it's the real being mindful. It's bringing yourself into the moment, and it's noticing what's around you. What does the air feel like on your face? What do your hands feel like? What are they touching? What can you touch around you? On my desk, I've got papers, I've got a pen. I can pick my pen up. I can focus on that pen for a moment. I focus on your breath. Look into the distance and back again. Look around, take in your surroundings, become present in your body, and that stops that negative thought cycles and that rumination. Things, try and look at the positive things in life. Try and notice the moments that bring any sense of joy or wonder. Notice the flower breaking through the concrete. Notice the way that the light hits a building. Try to consciously notice these things. Now, in my work, I bring that into every session with what's been good about your week, and I make that person go through a whole list. And if they don't, if they get stuck after 5 things, I'll wait. I'll wait. I've got all of the time in the world. I'm going to make you search in your brain for those positive things,
And find the
because
glimmer,
then that's
right?
it. And you're going to, yeah, absolutely. And you're going to build those neural pathways. Those positive neural pathways are building, and we're creating them, and they're getting stronger and stronger. And as they get stronger, those negative ones that we've built up, that they're getting weaker and weaker and weaker, as those positive ones grow stronger and stronger. And that's the way that people lift out of depression and anxiety. And when we're thinking positively and we're looking at positive things, we're thinking in that intellectual mind, in the prefrontal cortex, and not that primitive mind, that's just looking to protect us. We want to be in that intellectual mind where we can appreciate the beauty of the world and make connections and feel good and feel empowered and live the lives that we want.
Exactly. And family members of people struggling with mental health can do the same. And it's important to support your family members and give them acceptance and understanding and
Yeah.
compassion, but also giving yourself the self-care. Taking in those 10 special moments,
Yeah.
smelling the flowers,
I,
looking for those glimmers, those
yeah.
small moments, even a warm cup of tea, those
Yeah.
small moments, and noticing what's
And the
happened
most
in your body.
and the most important thing when a family member is going through all of this and you want to support them, the most number one most important thing to do is to validate their experience. A lot of people will be, they'll listen to it and they'll be like, oh, yeah, I completely understand what you're saying. I went through this and da 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 da, and it's just like, no. Um, you might that you might have been through that, but to assume that you know how somebody feels is very invalidating. And, it's always better to just be like, that must be really hard, because you can't imagine how they feel because it's so individual. It's so unique to a person's experience that nobody can really know what you're going through. And that's okay. They can still be there for you. They can still give you love and empathy and compassion and support. But if you validate that person's experience,
That's
that's
huge.
going to help them. Yeah,
It gives them support.
that's going to massively help them. So, one of the things is to, don't expect change. Stop asking if they're feeling better. Stop asking if they're in pain or if they're feeling better. Instead, ask them to join things. Ask them if they would like to be involved in things. Never exclude somebody because of what they're going through. Give them a choice, give them the opportunity. They might keep saying no, and that's okay. They can say no. Allow them to say no. There's no pressure, but this is happening. You can be involved if you want to be involved.
And
Ask
even
them the
like
level of involvement.
taking them for a
That's
walk.
it.
Like, let's go for a walk. Let's get outside. Nature is
Yeah,
healing. Movement can be healing, right?
that's it. And if they
Community.
can't, that's it. And if they can't get out for a walk, they might be too anxious to get out for a walk. Shall we sit in the window together and have a drink? Let's have a cup of tea while we sit in the window and get a bit of sunshine coming through that window. Somebody might be having, they might find that they're really not sleeping at night. They're finding mornings really hard. Would you like to come round for breakfast? Would you like me to come round and we could have breakfast together? Would you like to be involved in something that the community's doing? And if you would, what part would you like? Somebody might like to deep dive into something to take their mind off it. They might be in a position to do that. Or they might be able to put some chairs out or do something incredibly small that makes them feel included in a small way.
Okay.
All of these things to include people, but on their terms, at their ability, never expecting too much on them, never putting too much pressure on them, and never
That's
giving
huge.
them too many options,
Yes. I've learned from
because
that.
that's it.
Yes.
Choices are very hard when you've got mental health problems,
But
so
it's so
don't give
important. You
people
cannot
too
put
many
pressure on.
options.
You cannot, yes, cannot. It has to be very gentle on their terms. Now, people that are struggling with eating disorders, often it comes from a place of pain. There's a lot of shame that can be underneath it, low self-worth, fear. It often stems from developmental trauma from our childhood, from lack of control. It can be a learned behavior, right? For example, my daughter, she's 3. I'm very aware if she's upset, I'm not going to be giving her a cookie or a bowl of ice cream because I don't want her to learn to go to food when she's feeling sad, for example. Um, and it can be also learned behavior because when parents do not know how to have healthy coping mechanisms themselves, how are we expected to learn? Because we do learn from our parents. And when we do not have a regulated nervous system and we're feeling deep grief, or sadness, and we're not processing our emotions, and they're staying trapped in our body. This can all lead to eating disorders. What advice do you have for people that are struggling with eating disorders?
It's a really difficult one because disordered eating habits can, it covers such a vast array of reasons, and then the way that people have adapted and those disordered habits that they've created because of that. So it's really hard to kind of like talk about it all in sort of one kind of context. But you're really right. It comes from learned behavior. It comes from, when you're a child. Sometimes what you put in your mouth is just it's the only thing that you can control in your environment. Um, and then, and like you said quite rightly with your daughter, we give food to soothe, and food does soothe. And the way that our brains work, we get like great dopamine hits from having a biscuit, and then our brains, are really tricky, and they just say, oh, I want another biscuit because that dopamine hit felt really good. So then you have another biscuit, but that dopamine hit is not as big anymore. So then you're like, no, but I want that big dopamine hit that I got from the first biscuit. So I'm going to have another biscuit and another biscuit. And and then it becomes dopamine chasing. And a lot of people end up in food cycles of dopamine chasing. A lot of people, like you said, with the soothing, when we're upset, we feel that in our tummies. It's a very somatic feeling, but it's also there's a physiological reason behind that. And that's because that's where we produce serotonin in our guts. And that's the feel good, happy neurotransmitter that helps support our mentally healthy behavior. So when we're not producing much serotonin, when we're feeling down or when we're feeling stressed, when we're just feeling overwhelmed with the world for whatever reason, that serotonin production will be lower, and we will literally feel an emptiness in our tummy because there's no serotonin. So our brains say, oh, we need to fill that, because we do. We need to fill it with serotonin. But unfortunately, we say, oh, well, we'll fill it with food because it's in my tummy, so it must be food that I'm craving.
Because that's what we are almost programmed to do, right?
Well,
That's
that's
our
it. And
habit.
then
That's
yeah, and then you've got the cortisol loop. So cortisol, a stress hormone. So when we're stressed, when we're depressed, when we're overwhelmed, we're producing more cortisol. And cortisol makes us crave easy energy that we can store as fat. And it's a specific fat called adipose tissue. And that's your squishy belly fat. And the interesting thing about adipose tissue is that it can actually create its own hormones. And the hormone that creates is cortisol, the stress hormone. So you get into a cortisol loop where you're craving all of your carbs, all of your sugars, your chocolate, your ice cream, your pizza. That's what you're craving. And then you're eating it, and then your body is storing it purely as that adipose tissue. And it's doing that because it's in prolonged stress mode. So what it's making you do is store that energy so it's readily accessible for when you get to run away from that polar bear, because it thinks that you're hiding. There's polar bears stalking, there's tigers out there, there's all of that danger out there, and you're hiding, and you are packing in as much energy as readily available energy so that when the time is right you can escape.
mhm. And like
So we have
even like
all of these things that we have to fight against when it comes to what we're eating, when we're eating, and why we're eating. You know, it's a physiological, psychological minefield.
and even going to food can feel like a mother's hug. That's how comforting it can be. And if we didn't
Yeah,
receive that as a child, our mothers hugging us and telling us that we love them and felt loved by our mothers, that can also be a source. It's a
yeah,
source of comfort that just
absolutely.
can go to an extreme sometimes, and then it can become an
Yeah.
addiction, it can come into a disorder, and it's regulating our nervous system, giving us ourselves the love we never received, possibly, right? Giving
But
us this
that's it.
love.
Imagine that you've got a really disruptive home life and you've got a grandma that bakes the best things that you get whenever you go round. Or there's a dinner lady at school that's just really kind to you and gives you that extra portion every day. You know, just those moments of, it could be a local shopkeeper that sees your struggles day in, day out. So they just give you an extra sweet here and there, to make you feel better. Well, that carries through into your adult life, and then you've been programmed that love and the support that you so desperately needed, that comes with food.
Mhm. And even like holidays, I know we were talking that if our home life is unhealthy, but every holiday, for example, birthday, it's a big celebration and it's one good day. And we get that birthday cake. Or Christmas. Christmas, there's just a little bit more peace in the house. And that's when there's homemade food,
Yeah,
cookies, candy
yeah.
canes, even candy canes. I know where I like my candy canes. Um, and it can stem from something so small, but it gives us so much comfort in a time that we needed it. And as an adult, it can stem in,
Yeah.
yes.
Or it might be the scariest time of the day. It might be when the family comes together and it's chaotic and there's abuse. And you might be at the table, you might be subjected to hours of abuse. You might not be able to leave the table until you finish everything. You might not be able to eat. You might be paralyzed in fear and find eating incredibly difficult. There's many reasons that people shut down when it comes to food. Their experiences with food that are bonding for a lot of us. They become the really terrifying times for people. And, they have the absolute opposite of where they don't want to eat food and or they're certainly not going to eat home cooked food because that's a big trigger for them.
Exactly. How can people heal from eating disorders?
I think that getting in and processing those emotions, like with somatic practices, like embodied processing, that's phenomenal. So you're working with those emotions, you're processing those emotions, you're releasing the emotions that need to be released, and then you're using psychotherapy techniques in order to create new healthy habits. And, with the hypnotherapy and the psychotherapy, that can build really good resources for you to move forward in a life that's right for you.
And what is hypnotherapy?
So hypnotherapy is essentially psychotherapy. So it's neuroscience, but it's used with alongside the use of trance.
How can hypnotherapy help people that are struggling with mental health?
So hypnotherapy is great because you're working, like as I said, you're working with the latest up-to-date neuroscience. So you learn all about your brain. You're learning why we think and feel and behave the way that we do, and exactly what we can do to help that. And then what you're doing is, as you're learning those processes and building the goals that you want to take forward, you're having the added benefit of using trance to bring that conscious and subconscious together in focus. And then that strengthens your ability to make the changes that you want to make.
And one last question. How are we at home? Can we start to take away the stigma of mental health and trauma for ourselves, our loved ones?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, education, educating ourselves. We can, doesn't take much now. We've all got a phone connected to the internet. We can Google a few things very easily. Open conversations, not being scared about it. We need to be able to look people in the eye, and the best thing that you can do is, open a conversation about things. Promote understanding. So, and we can challenge misconceptions as well. So, people gossip. We know that we're all in little communities and everybody gossips, so don't gossip. Start joining in and having an open conversation about something. Discuss it. People are there. They're wanting to talk about it because otherwise they wouldn't be gossiping. Turn that gossiping into an open conversation. So why did somebody behave that way? Okay, if somebody's made a fool out of themselves, why? What's going on? Could there be something more to this? Does anybody know if they're okay? Start digging for a bit more information in a nice, kind, open way. Let's not just look at people's behavior and say and condemn them and shame them and gossip about them. Let's look a bit more into it. And if you start asking those questions, like, oh, do you think something's wrong? Do you think something's wrong at home, or are they having a hard time at work or something? Or, you know, asking those kind of conversations really opens that conversation up, and people do start to pay attention, because all of a sudden it's not just some silly behavior that they've noticed that they can gossip with their friends about. It's something that maybe they can do something about. And I think the majority of people do want to help each other.
And I think once people understand, often the judgment will go away and they
Yes,
will meet people with compassion and grace.
that's it. Absolutely.
It's when people don't understand. So if we can have
Yeah.
more open conversations, talk to our family, talk to our friends, talk to the people that we feel safe with, and be open.
Yeah.
There's no shame. Every single person on this planet has some type of struggle. It may not necessarily be with mental health. It's not always with trauma, but the majority of us have some type of struggle in our life. And if we can meet each other with more compassion, more grace, more understanding, how much better will our world be? Thank you so much for joining us. It was an
Thank
honor.
you, Erin. It's been lovely.